They told Karoline Leavitt to leave, expecting her to get angry. Her response left the whole diner in silence. Karoline Leavitt pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot in the middle of Springfield, Ohio. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering slightly, the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee slipping through the crack of the door every time someone walked in or out. She had heard about it from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. After a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, all she wanted was a quiet meal before the drive back. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The place was small but welcoming. At least, that's how it felt at first. It had the kind of warmth you'd expect from a long-standing establishment, where the same handful of regulars occupied the same booths every night. A wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The low hum of conversation mixed with the sizzle of the grill in the back. Then, something shifted. Karoline caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile, until she recognized her. It was quick, barely a second, but Karoline noticed it. A hesitation, the kind that flickered across a person's face when they suddenly weren't sure what to do. The hostess pressed her lips together in a thin line. A few customers turned their heads. A man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. A woman in a flannel shirt set down her coffee cup a little too hard, narrowing her eyes slightly before looking away. Karoline wasn't naive. She had been in enough rooms to sense when she wasn't entirely welcome. But a diner? Here? She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The tension in the air was unmistakable. This wasn't going to be just another meal. Here's the rewritten version of Section 2 with Karoline Leavitt, maintaining the original structure, tone, and adding dramatic tension. The hostess hesitated, then stepped forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said, her voice careful. Are you dining in or taking out? Karoline Leavitt let out a small, tired chuckle. Dining in, if that's all right. Another pause, too long for such a simple question. The hostess glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at Karoline. I need to check something real quick, just one moment. She disappeared through the swinging door. Karoline remained standing at the entrance, the weight of the room pressing on her. More heads had turned in her direction. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. Something wasn't right. From behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct to make out, but the urgency in their tone was clear. Karoline exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back. She wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe they had some kind of reservation policy. Maybe... The hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said, her voice firmer now. We can't serve you tonight. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Not, we're closing soon, not we're out of tables, just, we can't serve you. For a moment, Karoline said nothing. The diner had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. The grill still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere, but the usual hum of conversation had dulled. Eyes were on her now, watching, waiting. She studied the hostess's face. No hostility, just finality, like she had made up her mind. Or maybe someone else had made it up for her. Karoline cleared her throat. I'm sorry, did I do something wrong? The hostess didn't fidget this time. It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No explanation, no excuse, just a line drawn in the sand. Karoline felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. She had options. She could leave. She could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they had any idea how this would look by morning. Instead, she did none of those things. She simply straightened her shoulders, locked eyes with the hostess, and in a calm, unwavering voice said, Then I'd like to speak with the manager. The hostess hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen as if silently asking for permission. The tension in the room thickened. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, her expression calm but unwavering. The air around her felt charged, the quiet hum of the diner replaced by a palpable weight of unspoken judgment. She watched as the hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few more beats of silence, a sip of coffee, a plate being slid across the counter, then the door swung open. A man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, Don. Don didn't ask Karoline what she wanted. He just looked her over once, then said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it, it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. Karoline met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to throw her weight around, but she also wasn't about to just walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," Karoline said, her voice even. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, as if he had expected the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer it. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the handful of customers still watching. Some pretended not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight, "this ain't personal." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for." He glanced at the diners as if measuring the weight of their gazes. "I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." Karoline nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter where an older man in a work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, a younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. Karoline had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. This wasn't just about a single decision. It was about what it meant. It was about how it would look. It was about who was watching. She glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron, and for the first time Karoline saw something almost like discomfort, like maybe he wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before Don could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here, simple as that." Karoline turned toward him, studying him for a moment. He looked like the kind of guy who enjoyed a good fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something. She didn't bite. She just looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving," Karoline said, her voice calm. "If that's really what you want." The words hung there, giving Don a chance to take a breath, to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Don's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to Karoline. "I just don't want things to get ugly," Don said finally. Karoline nodded, her expression unreadable. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the diner was thick, pressing down on every corner of the room. Karoline Leavitt could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the customers watching from the booths, the waitress behind the counter shifting uncomfortably, even the cooks peeking through the kitchen window. She had options. She could walk out, shake her head, let it go. She could demand an explanation, call them out, remind them exactly who she was and how this would look if the media caught wind of it. Instead, she did none of those things. "All right," Karoline said, nodding slowly. Her voice was even, measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen as if seeking silent permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe she was actually going through with this. The hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few beats of silence passed, then the door swung open. Don stood there, arms crossed, his stance firm. "You got a question?" Karoline met his stare, unflinching. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I told you," he said, "this ain't personal." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me," she said. "What is it?" Don shifted his weight, his fingers tightening around the towel in his hand. He looked at Karoline Leavitt, then toward the handful of customers who were still pretending not to listen. "People around here got their opinions about you," he finally said. "About the things you stand for." His voice was rough, but there was something else beneath it. Something that sounded more like uncertainty than defiance. Karoline nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "And me sitting down for a meal, that's a problem?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the older man in the work jacket had gone back to his coffee, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, the younger man who had been watching the exchange from the start leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, smirking like he was enjoying the show. "I've got a business to run," Don finally said, "and I don't want trouble." Karoline studied him for a moment, then took a small step forward. "Be honest with me," she said. "Do you agree with this, or are you just trying to keep the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, exhaling sharply. But before he could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a short laugh. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "This isn't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." Karoline turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "And why is that?" she asked, her voice steady. The guy grinned. "Because we know who you really are." The younger man's words hung in the air, thick with challenge. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same calm intensity she had held throughout the conversation. "All right," she said, her voice even. "Then tell me, who am I?" For a split second, the younger man hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. Then he leaned forward, smirking. "You're just another politician pretending to care. You talk about the people, but at the end of the day, you're just like the rest, out for yourself." A murmur ran through the diner. Some nodded in agreement, others remained silent, watching. Karoline let the accusation settle before speaking. "So, let me get this straight," she said, resting her hands on the back of a chair. "You don't trust me because you think I don't understand real people?" The younger man shrugged. "That's about right." A small smile flickered across Karoline's lips, but it wasn't amusement. It was something sharper. "You know, I grew up watching people just like you get left behind. Hard-working folks. People who put their trust in leaders that promised them change, and then forgot about them the second the cameras stopped rolling." She turned back to Don. "You said people don't forget," she continued. "Neither do I." For the first time, Don looked uncertain. His fingers tapped lightly against the counter, as if weighing her words. The younger man scoffed, shaking his head. "That's a nice speech, but it doesn't change anything." Karoline met his gaze. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I didn't come here for a speech. I came here for a meal. And the only reason we're standing here instead of sitting down like decent people is because some of you decided I don't belong." The diner fell silent again. This time the weight of her words was undeniable. Don exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, his gaze flicking between Karoline Leavitt and the younger man. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The air was thick, charged with unspoken words, the weight of long-held frustrations pressing down on everyone. The younger man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You think one conversation is going to change anything? You think sitting here and talking makes a difference?" Karoline didn't blink. "If talking didn't matter, you wouldn't still be sitting here," she said. "You had every chance to walk out, but you didn't. So tell me, what do you really want to say?" The younger man opened his mouth, then hesitated. He had been ready for a fight, expecting her to snap back, to storm out, to give him a reason to dismiss her. Instead, she had done something no one in the diner had expected. She listened. Don sighed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now. "People around here have been burned before. They hear a lot of promises, but nothing changes. They don't trust politicians." Karoline nodded. "And I don't blame them for that." The younger man scoffed. "Then why are you here?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I don't run from tough conversations," she said. "Because if I left every room where people didn't agree with me, I wouldn't deserve to represent anyone." The room was dead silent. Even those who had been avoiding eye contact were now watching intently. Then from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, "Damn shame when a person can't even sit down for a meal." Don let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together. He looked at Karoline, then at the younger man, then finally toward the waitress. "Mary," he called, voice gruff but steady, "get her a menu." The diner fell into a stunned silence as Mary hesitated for just a second before reaching for a menu. The younger man scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, but he didn't argue. Karoline Leavitt took the menu with a small nod of thanks, her expression calm, unreadable. Don crossed his arms, watching her. "You know, serving you might come back to bite me," he admitted. Karoline set the menu down. "I'm not here to make your life harder, Don," she said. "I just want to understand." The younger man leaned forward in his booth, narrowing his eyes. "Understand what? That people don't trust you? That they don't believe a word politicians say?" She met his glare without flinching. "That's exactly what I want to understand." The younger man let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Come on. You really expect us to believe you care?" Karoline didn't look away. "I expect you to listen, and if you still think I'm full of it by the time I finish my meal, then at least I gave you the chance to say it to my face." A slow murmur rippled through the diner. The tension hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. A challenge had been placed on the table, one that couldn't be ignored. Dom exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's see what you've got to say." Mary returned a moment later, setting down a plate in front of Karoline, a classic diner cheeseburger with hand-cut fries. She picked up the burger, took a deliberate bite, and set it down, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Well?" Don asked, watching her carefully. Karoline smirked. "Little dry," she said. For a second, the diner was dead still. Then, unexpectedly, Don barked out a laugh. A few others chuckled, and even the younger man leaned back, his smirk fading into something more thoughtful. The ice had cracked, the conversation wasn't over, but for the first time, people were listening. The tension in the diner hadn't vanished, but it had changed. The room no longer felt like a battlefield, but rather a place on the edge of something that could shift in any direction. Don wiped his hands on his apron and sat down across from Karoline Leavitt, watching her carefully. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now, less of a challenge and more of a test. "You're still sitting here. So tell me, what is it you really want?" She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together. "I want to know why people like you, people who work hard, who care about their families, who've built this country, don't trust people like me," she said. Her voice steady. The younger man in the booth scoffed. "Seriously?" he shot back. "You don't get it? People like you show up, shake hands, talk a good game, and then disappear. Nothing ever changes." A murmur of agreement rippled through the diner. Even Don nodded slightly, his jaw tightening. Karoline didn't argue. She let the silence stretch, the weight of the words filling the space. Then she exhaled slowly. "You're right," she said. That caught them off guard. The younger man blinked. Even Dunn looked surprised. Karoline tapped a knuckle against the table. "I've seen what happens when promises get broken. I grew up watching people struggle, wondering why no one in power seemed to care. And yeah, I got into politics, and I've had to make choices that don't always sit right with everyone. but I haven't forgotten where I came from, and I sure as hell haven't forgotten the people I came from." The younger man's smirk had disappeared entirely. He was listening now. Don studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're saying all the right things," he admitted. "But words ain't enough." Karoline nodded. "I know," she said simply. "That's why I stayed." And with that, for the first time that night, the room felt different. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something real, something that mattered. The diner was silent, the weight of Karoline Leavitt's words lingering in the air. Don's fingers drummed against the tabletop, his expression unreadable. The younger man in the booth, who had been so quick to challenge her, now sat back, arms crossed but lips pressed tightly together. The tension hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. It wasn't hostility anymore. It was something closer to curiosity. "You say you stayed," Don finally said, voice low. "But what happens when you leave? What happens when we don't see you again? When it's just us? Same as before?" A murmur of agreement spread through the diner. The fear wasn't just about her. It was about what had come before. Leaders who spoke well but left broken promises in their wake. Karoline took a deep breath. "I won't stand here and promise you the world," she said. "I won't tell you I have all the answers. But I will tell you this. I came in here tonight just looking for a meal, and instead, I got something better." She glanced around the room. "I got to hear you." Don let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. The younger man scoffed, but didn't speak. The waitress behind the counter, who had stayed quiet all night, shifted slightly, her gaze softening. For the first time, Karoline wasn't just a politician to them. She was someone who had listened. And sometimes that was the first step to something real. Lessons from Karoline Leavitt, The Power of Listening and Standing Firm. Karoline Leavitt's experience at the diner teaches us an important lesson. True leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about understanding people. In today's world where conversations are often driven by division and distrust, here are key takeaways to apply in everyday life. Don't walk away from difficult conversation. Karoline could have stormed out when she was told to leave, but she didn't. She stayed, listened, and engaged. In life, walking away from tough discussions doesn't solve anything. If you want to make a difference, stay and hear people out, even when it's uncomfortable. Listening is more powerful than speaking. The people in the diner weren't interested in speeches or political slogans. They wanted to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue your point, but to listen with an open mind. When people feel understood, real conversations begin. Prove yourself through actions, not just words. Don and his customers didn't trust Karoline at first, and for good reason. They had been let down before. Instead of making empty promises, she showed her sincerity through patience and presence. In your own life, don't expect trust to be given freely. Earn it through consistency, honesty, and action. Change begins with one conversation. One meal in a diner didn't solve everything, but it opened the door to something real. Never underestimate the impact of a single conversation. Change starts with connection, and connection starts with the courage to listen and engage.